Hello everyone, I'm John Mitchell, I'm the Director of ALNAP, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our event on Facing the Unknown, Managing Uncertainty in Humanitarian Action. So we would have loved to have a meeting with all of you present in the way that we usually do at our annual meetings, but alas, circumstances dictate otherwise. Nevertheless, we still have a packed agenda which will set up an ongoing conversation with you until we're able to meet again, hopefully next year at a full 2-day annual meeting. So there are two main things that we should try and achieve today. The first thing is to learn more about the tangible experiences of organisations who are grappling with the challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic, and also to acquire new tools and knowledge to help address the challenges ahead. And the second thing is to identify some key research questions on uncertainty, which we in ALNAP will use to inform the content of our full 2-day annual meeting, hopefully held in person next year. Now, this is likely to depend on the new vaccine rollout, of course, and so we'll have to wait and see what happens. Now, before we get to the substantive agenda, I'd like to set up the discussions with a few thoughts about uncertainty and the humanitarian system. So, uncertainty means a lack of information or understanding that inhibits action. And we can be uncertain about the present situation, about the options we have in front of us, or about what the future will hold. These situations are often uncomfortable, but they're also very familiar terrain for humanitarians, accustomed as we are to working in very unstable environments. But even before the COVID pandemic, levels of uncertainty were increasing. So let me wind the clock back 12 months and remind us of 4 key drivers of uncertainty at the time. Now, the first thing was that in 2019, the volume of humanitarian assistance dropped by about $1.6 billion US. And this is the first time since 2012 that we've seen a fall in funding. And it was impossible to say whether this was a blip or the beginning of an unwelcome trend. The second thing was that estimations of humanitarian need were also growing, and gaps between need and funding were running at about 40 to 50%. Most of us felt that was likely to continue and will probably increase. And thirdly, changes in the geopolitical environment resulted in a shift away from the multilateral cooperation that we've enjoyed and away from a rules-based order. And this had a serious effect on the operational environment in which assistance and protection took place. States that traditionally provided political and financial support to international humanitarian action appeared to have less supportive to IHL and refugee law. And all of this had a negative impact on the ease of access and the ability of humanitarians to protect vulnerable populations. And fourth, we had seen a migration crisis and substantial changes to protracted conflict and refugee environments. And new actors like international finance institutions and peacekeepers were entering humanitarian space, hence all the nexus debates. And this has all added to uncertainty around the role of humanitarian action in these types of crises. So last year, we're at a point where we were trying to come to terms with a more fragile funding environment, a new geopolitical landscape, and a more complicated operating environment for which the system did not seem prepared. Now, to add a bit of balance here, we'd also seen some improvements in some areas, but the fact was there'd been little or no changes in the formal architecture of the system to deal with these major areas of uncertainty. And then, as we all know, we're hit by a global pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen for a century, and suddenly everything looks and feels infinitely more uncertain. So our agenda today is designed to look at the current state of uncertainty, and to this end, we're going to focus on 3 main areas to be addressed in parallel breakout groups later. Now, the first will focus on what tools are available to help to prepare for and manage operational challenges, and hear how agencies have tried to adapt, modify, and manage ongoing problems. The second group will share experiences about how to manage uncertainty affecting resources And here I'm talking about shrinking budgets, unpredictable staffing environments, changes in partnership arrangements, and basic ways of working. And the third group will attempt to identify the possibilities for finding new ways of working and locking in positive changes and improvements, maybe even moving towards a more new and more efficient business model for the future. So before the breakout groups, we're going to hear more about how we can understand today's uncertainties. We're going to hear from field level practitioners, a senior humanitarian leader, and an affected community on how all of them have experienced uncertainty this year. So let's get going, and I'm delighted to introduce Eilidh Kennedy, the Director of Iran, who is going to tell us about the drivers of the current situation and the implications for humanitarian organizations. Eilidh, over to you. Good to see you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon to those of you joining us today. I just want to pick up on what John has been talking about uncertainty. One of the things we know about the future is that the range of possible futures increases over time. This means that from our present moment to whichever point we pick in the future, the number of different possibilities of different kinds of challenges, as well as different opportunities that are going to present themselves, increases. This gives us more and more scope to design the kind of futures we want to pursue, but it also means that we have to better manage the growing uncertainty that we face. Disruptions often occur when you're trying to think about the future, and this is why we try not to engage in predictive futures, but rather I'd like to talk to you more today about foresight and how we can try and understand the range of uncertainty by thinking about multiple futures. As disruptions occur, one of the things we want to do is try and manage what some of those things are, and COVID-19 is one such example. The presentation I'm giving today is based on some foresight and trends analysis for the COVID-19 epidemic that we have done supporting humanitarian actors throughout this crisis. What I mean by this is to think about a COVID plus world. There is hardly an area of the world that hasn't been touched by COVID-19. It's affecting all of the areas of humanitarian work, how we operate, how programs are funded, and especially humanitarian staff themselves. Operationally, this has an impact on staff safety, it has an impact on supply chain issues, as well as the potential politicization of the health agenda, having to manage a highly changeable and very dynamic environment, which is something that we have some experience as humanitarians. It's likely not on this scale. And finally, a dramatically escalating levels of need as both the economic crisis of the pandemic and the pandemic itself affect communities around the world. It's also touching on areas of resourcing and staff well-being. The levels of funding are declining. As John mentioned, that was something that had been raised even before the COVID-19 pandemic, but as a result of the economic slowdown, that's something that's likely to intensify. This might mean there's a reallocation of funding from existing priorities and programs to address COVID needs, which might mean that gaps appear across the system in different places. Our funding systems are also not structured well to fund those who have access today, which can mean that it's quite a slow process to get money from donors, pledges, down to the ground of the people doing the work today. And as far as staff well-being goes, mental health and the motivation of staff can be seriously undermined by feelings of ineffectiveness and by feelings of uncertainty, as well as having to manage the situation of working from home and all of the uncertainty that COVID brings in their personal lives. While all of these things are challenges, I also want to talk a little bit about transformation. COVID-19 is presenting us with some opportunities to work differently. And part of that gives us the opportunity to design the kind of future that we want to try and pursue. We have more agency in this, and if we invest resources and if we think strategically, we can work to translate disruption into transformation. I want to go into a little bit of detail now about the trends and uncertainties that are likely to continue to affect our operating environment. The first are the restriction on the movement of goods and people. These have been implemented to different levels and in different places, and sometimes recurrently, which leads to quite significant disruption, particularly at the domestic level. This is likely to continue to have an effect on our ability to transport goods and people to the places where they're needed. The availability of protective equipment and access to vaccines. This is likely to continue to be highly unequal. The ability to get protective equipment and access to vaccines to humanitarians who are doing the work on the ground every day is likely to continue to be quite a challenge, even as vaccines are rolled out over the next 18 months to 2 years. The securitization of healthcare. This is quite an important point, which we think is a very nascent trend at the moment, but it's a real uncertainty and risk that we face, whereby governments preoccupied with trying to protect their domestic populations against pandemics such as COVID-19 try to securitize the health agenda. We saw this slightly with the migration agenda as well, and both of these are quite heavily tied, where countries start to put money from their overseas development pots into ensuring that programs are run such that it protects their own domestic populations, rather than necessarily what's most effective for countries that are more severely affected. And finally, increasing needs. There have been a range of different scenarios posited for what the increases in poverty and hunger will be, but it's likely that they're going to be substantial as a result of the economic downturn, decreased rates of remittances, and the way in which people struggle, particularly informal workers, to continue to receive their wages. This takes us on to resources and well-being, the funding of humanitarian aid. As I mentioned in my introduction, it's likely that given levels of increasing national and personal debt, we're going to see declining levels of overseas development assistance. Simply as a matter of economic contraction, these sources of funds tend to decrease. While funding levels that flow through the formal humanitarian system are likely to be quite severely affected by this, one thing that's absolutely essential for us to pay close attention to is the fact that in times of economic contraction, the amount of remittances which are transmitted home often decline as well. And these sources of cash are hugely important for communities on the ground and for businesses on the ground. So that's an area where we might see escalating needs associated with diminishing resources, though not necessarily those resources which flow directly through formal humanitarian actors. Another aspect which might diminish some of the resources that are available is a prioritization by institutional donors and some private donors of domestic support. As big holes are created within national budgets, the spending for the COVID response has been quite high from OECD governments, combined with the economic contraction. We're likely to see governments start to try and prioritize away from development assistance. Moving on to staff well-being, escalating levels of stress at home because of limited social engagement, increases in levels of unemployment among community and family, disruption to schooling and childcare, as well as the continued uncertainty, means that for humanitarian staff having to bear not only the uncertainty within their own lives, but also trying to be effective in an environment where uncertainty is rife through their work is incredibly challenging. Another component of this is that we're likely to see intensifying inequality between humanitarian staff themselves, and this is something that humanitarian organizations must consider. How can we ensure that for humanitarian actors, for those who are able to work from home, may be the ones who have quicker access to things such as vaccinations, rather than those who are doing the field work on the ground? While that was a long list of things that are very challenging for humanitarian organizations in this time of COVID-19, I want to end by talking about transformation. The fact of the matter is that the necessity for flexible working practices is likely to continue for several years. Locally led implementation is no longer an option. We've been saying that for a while, but in today's environment where the local context can shift on a weekly basis, it becomes ever more imperative that local organizations are put at the forefront of decision making. This is something that really, it will be incredibly difficult to be effective without. And that again is something that's unlikely to shift significantly for some time. Finally, as we focus on the duration of this upheaval, it behooves us to try and embrace it and to think about how we can use some of these disruptions to transform them into positive change for the humanitarian organization. How can we try and leverage the changing context to achieve some of the goals that we have struggled to make progress to for several years? There's a difference between managing uncertainty and creating new futures, and this is all tied to our mindset. Can we embrace it, and can we really try to be strategic in our thinking to try and make the most of the opportunities when they arise? Thank you, John.
There we go. I'll start again. I'm not sure if you heard what I said there, so I'll say it again. Eilidh, I was just thanking you very much for this very rich and practical summary, which has given us an excellent framework for understanding the issue. I bet there are many questions for follow-up, and there's a great deal of food for thought. So can I remind everyone that if you want to ask Eilidh questions, please do so in the Q&A box. I'm sure you'll have many. We will review them, and we'll have a question and answer session in a few minutes. But in the meantime, we're going to play 3 different videos to get a sense of how COVID-19 has impacted different groups in very different parts of the humanitarian world. Now, first, we are going to Mark Lowcock, the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, who I interviewed last week. He actually very kindly fitted me in as he was eating his breakfast opposite the UN building in New York. So thanks to him for finding a bit of time there. So comms team, can we go over to Mark Lowcock in the UN? Very good to see you and welcome to our ALNAP meeting. I have a few questions for you. And the first one is about OCHA funding and how this has been affected. I know that you've made some big appeals to fund the COVID response plan, and it will be really interesting to know how donors have responded. And if the plan is still underfunded, how optimistic are you about getting adequate funding for the future?
The overall effect of COVID-19 has been dramatically, obviously, to increase humanitarian needs around the world. And that is a combination of the effect of the virus itself, but also the consequences of the virus, the secondary indirect effects, if you like. In fact, those secondary indirect effects, which are about increased food insecurity, decline in health services, lots of children out of school, they're much bigger in the very poorest countries than the direct effects. On the fundraising side, in 2018, we raised $16 billion, which is a record actually for the appeals I coordinate. In 2019, we raised $18 billion. Significant increase, obviously another record. And I think this year in 2020, we'll raise $20 billion. So the good news is we're raising more money. The bad news is the gap between what we need and what we get is growing.
Mark, it's great to hear that the funding trend is upwards. That's very, very good news. It's a little bit more alarming to hear that the gap between need and funding is growing wider at the same time. So that seems to be getting bigger. Are you optimistic that actually funds will be forthcoming in the future to be able to reduce that gap? Or do you think it's actually going to get bigger?
The thing that I have been disappointed about during the course of the 2020 response is that some of the things that were done in the 2008-9 financial crisis, which is the last big event affecting the economies of every country on the planet and is the biggest secondary effect basically of the pandemic, have not been done this time. Rich countries have basically thrown away the rule book they had for supporting their own economies. You know, they've pumped huge amounts of money into social protection systems and to credit lines for businesses and furlough schemes and all those kinds of things. And the very poorest countries don't have the resources or the capacity to do that. So they're reliant on international institutions. And it's been surprising and shocking to me that the shareholders haven't been able to agree to do the same thing for those very poorest countries as happened in 2008-9. Now, we'll have to see whether that changes as we go into 2021. something like 60% of the money we get for humanitarian action comes from just 4 places. It comes from the US, by far the biggest, from Germany, from the European Commission, and from the UK. And that share, unfortunately, this year is getting higher. And one thing we need to do is to share the burden more fairly. And that does mean other countries with resources stepping up a bit more to come to the aid of the very, very most fragile.
I could move on now and ask you about OCHA's work in terms of, bread and butter work that you do around coordination, supply chains and logistics. How have they been affected by the pandemic?
Firstly, we had to compensate for the disappearance of transport systems. Secondly, in quite a few places, we've seen greater difficulty in getting access to populations in need. Visa problems, mobility problems, and so on. Now, I have to say that it's incredibly impressive how effectively humanitarian organizations have navigated that. For all the fact that we've got the world's worst crisis for 50 years, and in many places things are still getting worse, and I'm afraid into 2021 they will continue to get worse. They would have been much, much worse than they are at the moment, or they will be, without the extraordinary efforts and exemplary courage and commitment of humanitarian agencies and their staff.
Mark, finally, if I may turn to the more positive, to a more positive outlook. I mean, a lot of people do believe that when we're in the middle of a catastrophe such as the COVID-19 pandemic, everything's thrown up in the air, there's opportunities for change and improvement. From where you look at things, if there was one action that the humanitarian community could take in order to improve the business model that we have, what would it be?
If I could wave my magic wand, my non-existent magic wand, and get a step change on one thing, it would actually be much greater use of cash, because the easiest, fastest way to help most people is to give them the wherewithal in a dignified way to solve their own problems. And we've seen a growth in the use of cash in humanitarian settings over recent years, but we could have a transformation, and that would make for a better system which is more accountable to the people we say we want to be accountable to, is more dignified, gives people more control over their own lives. So that would be the way I would wave my non-existent magic wand.
So it was interesting to hear Mark saying that he would like to see other big players stepping up with more funds as we move forward. I certainly hope he's right, but I did read an article in the paper over my breakfast this morning that the UK government, at least, are considering cutting the aid budget to pay for the costs with managing COVID. Anyway, we'll see what happens. And now we're going to zoom over to the other side of the world, specifically to Marsabit in northern Kenya, to hear a first-hand account of how uncertainty in the livestock market has taken a significant toll on the economic life of pastoralist communities. So over to Marsabit.
Naitwa Lilian Lekoo, mimi ni mkazi wa Merile hapa. Nilikuwa nafanya biashara ya mbuzi. Kwa nauza mbuzi, nanunua mbuzi, nauza, napata faida. Lakini kutoka COVID ianze, tumeanza kuadhirika sana kwa sababu hakuna faida yoyote tena. Kwa tunategemea mbuzi kuuza, lakini saa hii hakuna biashara nyingine. Mbuzi saa hii wenye walikuwa wanakuja kutununua kwetu ndio waende kuuza, wameambiwa hakuna kuingia tena hapa Merile. Sasa tumeanza kumia kabisa. Juu biashara hakuna nyingine tunaweza fanya tena. Ni hiyo tu ya mbuzi. Sasa tumeumia kabisa juu wamefunga soko. Sasa hii hakuna biashara nyingine.
Sasa tangu korona ianze tumeona shida mingi kwa sababu hakuna mali tunategemea. Tulikuwa tunategemea wanyama, sasa hakuna mali tunaweza uza na sasa tuko na shida mingi kuanzia korona ianze. Tangu korona ianze wanyama tulikuwa tunaleta wanyama pande hii. So hata sasa tangu korona ianze.
Mimi ni mama wa watoto wawili. Nilikuwa hata hiyo pesa nikipata, mtoto wangu ako nursery school hapa na ni private. Nilikuwa nikipata hiyo pesa naweza enda kumlipia school fees hapo. Saa hii hakuna, sasa shule wamefunga.
Hapo ndo tulikuwa tunategemea kupata naye chakula. Sababu kuanzia sasa hivi hatuna kitu ya kutegemea naye, maana ile kitu tulikuwa nayo tulikuwa tunanunua naye mbuzi ndio tunakulanga sasa hivi. Hiyo pesa ndio tulikuwa tunanunua. Kwa sababu hakuna mali tulikuwa tunanunua naye mbuzi hapa. Sasa yenye ile nini tulikuwa naye, pesa tulikuwa naye ndio tunaanza kula sasa. Sasa tunakaa tu hivyo unless basi tuone yenye itafanyika tena kama hii ugonjwa itaisha.
Yeah, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. It's a great reminder about what our work is all about. Now, Marsabit is a tough place to live, but in my own short time working there, I also found it to be a very beautiful place. And here, special thanks to Mamo Ali, who works for the Indigenous Resource Management Organization, and to an organization called Local to Global Protection for making this video possible. And our third video is going to take us to the Philippines and the Ukraine, where we're taking 1 foot out of the humanitarian sector to hear from a network of women peace builders on their COVID-related experiences. And here we spoke with Maria Dmytriyeva of the Democracy Development Center in Ukraine, and Cynth Zephanee Nietes, a member of the Young Women's Leaders for Peace in the Philippines. And my sincere apologies to both of you if my pronunciation was less than perfect. So Danny, can you take us over to the Philippines and Ukraine? Thanks.
In Ukraine, we have been living in the conditions of uncertainty for quite some time now. And for women living in the conflict-affected areas, it has been even worse than that. When we don't have access to information and we lack in social cohesion, this all creates rich grounds for uncertainty, and it weighs down heavily on us. And in the conditions of the pandemic with COVID, it has all gone even worse than that. This all contributes to isolation of local leaders, and it all makes the feeling of uncertainty even worse. So another issue is the funding. The funds for local peace building has become even more scarce than before, and if you don't have reliable funding, it is even more difficult to plan, and that all again makes uncertainty deeper.
I completely agree with you. And for women and young women peace builders, uncertainties are always there, right? If you know how to accept that everything ain't certain, you'll know how to manage to create a plan. And the basic ingredient for planning is to get the data. Hence, the data, you will get that from having a dialogue. That's why having a dialogue, it's the basic component or a key component for peace building. Uncertainty is always present. That's why you need to have a strong mind, and you have to have your strong heart to conquer everything that flows because of uncertainties. Just to share our experiences here in the Philippines during this COVID-19 pandemic, where uncertainty is the only certain issue in the country. young people, for example, me and my colleagues in the Young Women Peace leaders, or mobilized ourselves. We mobilized immediately. We became more of a volunteer for everything. We became braver to work at the front lines. We kept communicating, opening a dialogue. Because of this dialogue, we know their problems and we tried to address their problems. And that's one of the most, I think, amazing things that we do, even if it's uncertain.
To me, a key component to dealing with uncertainty is care, both self-care and caring for others. And this is what women peace builders are really skilled at. We used our existing networks to reach out to women in remote villages and to women who might be feeling isolated. And with the help of our local networks, we offered these women psychological counseling and legal advice. And this helped reduce the stress and uncertainty they experienced because they now know that there are people out there who care and who are willing to help and reach out and be there for them.
So it was so fascinating to hear this rather intimate conversation, which I thought had great authenticity and emotional content. But let's just take a very quick breath now. I began by reminding us about the fairly high level of uncertainty before the pandemic, and Eilidh has provided us with a framework for understanding the current situation. And we've also just been given a flavour of how the impact has played out in one key UN organisation, in one vulnerable community, and also in a civil society group. The big question that we're facing for the rest of this event is, what can we do about it? And we'd love to hear from all of you at this point. And I'm going to hand over to our facilitators, Alice Obrecht, who is ALNAP's Head of Research, and Aarathi Krishnan, who is the Strategy and Foresight Advisor for UNDP. So Alice and Aarathi, over to you.
Thanks so much, John. And good morning, good afternoon to all of you. So as John has mentioned, this is a moment for all of us to stop, kind of take stock on the past year and reflect on what we've all been learning about how to manage uncertainty, and in particular, the unique challenges brought by this once in a century global pandemic. So we spent a lot of time this afternoon, hearing a lot about the problems that COVID-19 have posed, but the rest of this online event and the rest of this session is really focused on exploring solutions. And I want to start by posing two questions to you, our audience, because we want to hear from you and get you engaged in the conversation. So please send your response in the chat box and indicate your name and what country you're writing in from and which organization you're with. So the first question I have for all of you is, what's helping you manage the challenges related to COVID-19? Please share the approaches and tools and ways of working that you've found helpful in managing the challenges related to COVID-19. And then the second question is, where do you see the gaps in your approach or skill sets? And finally, as John's already mentioned, please also use the Q&A section to throw in some questions for Aarathi and for Eilidh, who will be joining us in a few minutes as well. So now I'm very excited to be joined by Aarathi Krishnan, who, as John mentioned, is the Strategy and Foresight Advisor at UNDP. Aarathi works on strategic foresight and systems and complexity thinking, which can sound very scary and intimidating, but thankfully Aarathi has a lot of experience in applying these approaches very practically across many humanitarian organizations, most recently in co-leading the Global Strategy 2030 for the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, as well as her work with the World Economic Forum. So thanks so much for joining us, Aarathi. I'm going to start off with a fairly basic question, which is to ask you to tell us, what is foresight? As I mentioned, it sounds a bit intimidating. Eilidh mentioned it and gave a very clear presentation, but can you tell us what is foresight and what makes for a good foresight approach?
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. It's wonderful to be here and to be on this fantastic panel. And you know, a really good framing of these conversations by Eilidh and our previous presenters. So I want to talk about, well, what is this actually, and where do we find our starting point? So first of all, I often in our sector, we use these terms interchangeably a little bit. And there is a difference. Often we, for those of us that play in strategy or innovation or policy or change in any way, we might do a certain element of a foresight process, and we might use different types of futures methodologies. The most common of these being things like a trend analysis you might do before you write a strategy process, etc. Or something like what Yaren worked through with Eilidh, which is like producing different sets of scenarios, etc. So there are different approaches and methodologies we might use as part of the process. Strategic foresight, however, is a much more encompassing process, and it's fundamentally the way I see it in my world. Really, it's about change. How do we bring about change? Good foresight, good strategic foresight is one that combines both using really robust futures methodologies, a very robust systems and complexity analysis, and then blending things like, leading to what are those strategic transformations, what are those points of innovation or experimentation that we need to happen. And I think often we get confused a little bit, and we think just doing a scenario or doing a futures analysis or a trend analysis will solve the problem, but there's so many other things that have to happen after that, and that's where that trick, and I guess that's where the difficulty comes in sometimes, is often when you have an idea of what these insights are generating for us, but what do we actually do, and how do we bring about that change fundamentally?
Great, thank you so much. I actually want to pop over to Eilidh, because what you've just said, Aarathi, echoes something that came up in the morning session. So I just want to pose this back to Eilidh again for our audience in the second session to hear, because I think they'll find it quite interesting. So Eilidh, in the morning, this issue came up about when we use something like scenario planning, there can be issues around financial constraints that humanitarian organizations face. So humanitarian organizations might not have the same kind of funding portfolio that a private sector organization has to fully resource themselves for multiple different futures, right? So they have to kind of pick one and think a bit more strategically about how they're allocating their resources. So could you say a bit more about, Aarathi's talking about using these approaches in a really practical way to actually inform decisions on what we do about the future. Can you talk about how strategy comes in with the scenario planning element of this, and how humanitarian organizations can do this given their more constrained financial situation?
Certainly. Well, I think, Aarathi hit exactly the nail on the head. Scenarios are useless unless you're going to transform them into action. So part of what we often try to do is to work with organizations to think through how they can operate across multiple different futures. There are a couple of different ways you can use scenario analysis when you're trying to move into decision making. In pre-COVID times, we would sometimes, often work with humanitarian actors to think more about designing new futures. So what kind of future do you want to try and seek in a particular context? And how can we identify different pathways to achieving that, so that you know better how you can try and allocate your resources, both financial and human, who you need to be working with, and how you can think creatively about leveraging these different points of change. But that's one way to use scenarios. Another way to use scenarios is to think about scenarios and scenario planning as a way to increase your flexibility and how robust a strategy you can develop. So when we engage in scenario planning around something like COVID-19, what we've been working with humanitarian agencies to do is to consider across the different futures that we identify, be they looking out to 2025, for example, what are some of the sort of no regrets investments you can make? So often in a scenario analysis, you might find a couple of different investments which would make you more effective across multiple different futures. And that's sort of low-hanging fruit. Once you've done that analysis and you've identified those areas, you can start to put resources in that direction. But another thing you can try and do, and I know that Aarathi and I have sort of worked on different methodologies to try and make these more flexible and easier for humanitarians to use, so that they're both lighter in terms of the financial implications, but also more participative and inclusive. And one of the things we try and do through that process is to help people to use foresight to identify how they can create a strategy which is more flexible as you're managing a very dynamic environment. This means looking at a strategic idea, a strategic option, and sort of testing it and seeing how it would fit across multiple different futures. And this allows you to analyze how effective your strategy would be if your context changes. And sometimes there are times and options where you can create a strategy that's more robust and more flexible. And in a time that's highly changeable, such as COVID-19, this is often what humanitarian practitioners are asking us to help them do. Another really critical element about translating scenario planning into decision-making, which I think Aarathi also touched on and is key, is the fact that we often look at this through contingency planning and challenges, but really scenario planning is also about trying to identify opportunities and where you can find those opportunities to try and ensure that you're pursuing them and making the most of them. And that's a huge problem that we try and address through foresight, is to try and lift people out of what can feel like a really overwhelming everyday situation to identify where these options are and put resources in those directions. So those are just a couple of ideas of how we use scenarios in decision making. But I think Aarathi has it exactly right. Analysis is only as useful as the people who are going to use it. So you have to really think that through and make those investments when designing a project like this.
Great, thanks so much, Eilidh. I'd love to get Aarathi's kind of reaction to that, but also Aarathi, another question for you. I think one of the common benefits that's said about Foresight's approaches is that in order to really use it as a mechanism for change, as you were talking about a few minutes ago, we need to use it to challenge some of the assumptions we have about the future, or assumptions that we have about our working model of how things should operate. And I was wondering if you could kind of go into a bit more detail there on what are some of the assumptions that humanitarian organizations are making that can inhibit how they engage with these new or unfamiliar challenges like COVID-19, and how can we start to change those assumptions as a sector?
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Eilidh. Thank you, Alice. Okay, I mean, I guess I'm going to speak at this based on my experience and my expertise, and I'm certainly not passing them off as you know, as the du jour of the sector. But from my lens, we have in the sector, we have a certain idea about the centrality of our role. So even when we design different or think about different types of futures or different scenarios, we never quite imagine a future without our role, our institutional role, and our individual role, to be honest, somehow as a central figure within that. So we sort of see the future and the trends and the changes and the drivers and the signals all as exogenous changes that we must respond to externally, but we don't have to change, right? Any sort of idea about the future where a humanitarian organization doesn't play a key role, let alone a leadership role as part of that, is not often talked about. We might talk about it in some sort of speculative way, like, you know, localization, grand bargain. We've been talking about these for how long? So I want to question and come back to my point. How does change happen? So are we therefore genuinely unpacking the not just the broad drivers of change that are happening, but what is forcing that change underneath it? What are the trends? What are the signals? What are the tipping points? What are the leverages? Are we paying attention to that? Because as Eilidh said, it's often when we're not paying attention to that stuff, that's when the relevance questions comes into it. So coming back to my point about the centrality of our role, we make assumptions about the continuation of our role in the exact ways it is now, our business model, our funding, our financing structures, etc. We talk about things like, okay, fine, you know, better affected populations or beneficiaries or whatever term you want to use, that's already, again, out of touch with where the rhetoric and our thinking and our learning has gone. But we haven't changed how we make decisions and how we decide how investment is going to be restructured and who is around that decision-making table when that discussion happens, right? So we come back to how our decision, how does change actually happen? The second thing I want to I guess, challenge us all. We don't often go beyond first order assumptions and consequences at a surface level, right? We don't often think about, well, what's a second order? What's a third order? We still think about things in silos. And this is where, to my earlier point, if we're doing this work without doing a systems or complexity modeling as part of it, it's not going to get us anywhere. Because what we must understand is what are the systemic structures and the systemic and structural points that also need to shift. How do we go, and we're not just talking about things like, what's going to happen in the near term, but how do we think about things from a midterm and a long term? And I want to come back to I want to use this to go into a third point, which is around long-termism. And I think it's around where do we see our obligations? And often in humanitarian work, we see our obligation to putting out the fire right in front of us, right? We have to solve the problem. We have to save the day right in front of us. I wonder then, a provocation for us is it time that we shifted our focus a little bit, our obligations? We still have to put out the fire in front of us. This isn't a binary discussion, but surely we have an obligation to our planet. We have an obligation to our future generations. And so when we start to think about what are the intended and unintended consequences of the decisions we're making, not just today, but in the long term, we're able to shift that. I think I want to talk about how the last point I want to make, I guess, is I just want to stress the point about how does change actually happen? Because we can have all the great analysis in the whole wide world. We come down to, are we ready to make those decisions? And what will influence people to make different decisions? What is different this time around, right? Somebody, I think, coined this year, because, at the start of the year when everybody was talking about COVID, people were saying it was the black swan. And, no, it's not the black swan. We've been talking about, it's been in every trend analysis over the last decade. The issue wasn't that it wasn't there. The issue was the lack of willingness to make any kind of planning decision based on something that is, would be coming at us. So somebody coined the term a gray rhino, that we can see something sort of hurtling towards us in its impact, in its breadth, and yet we still don't make a decision to do anything differently. And we've seen this replicated throughout our history over and over again. We keep being taken by surprise, right? So how do we understand how and why decisions are made, and how do we influence those decisions to be made in different ways? It's a chessboard. So how do we move those chess pieces to influence different types of behaviors? How do we start to think about these trends, again, as interconnected risks, connected also into institutional and individual bias, and start to also bring in leverage and tipping points in that? I want to end with this one thing. We can talk about, foresight or innovation or uncertainty or experimentation, all these words. It is a change process fundamentally, and it is a deeply personal change process. And I think, Alice, I once said this to you, I think, but there's a phrase I often like to say, we all signed up to do this work because we thought we were going to change the world, but we didn't think that we would have to change ourselves as part of that process. And until we understand that any sort of change requires a different type of role for us, and we're willing to explore what that new role might be, then these are just really interesting conversations to have.
Great. Thank you so much, Aarathi. Lots of food for thought. I'm going to I will be going to the chat box soon, but before I do so, I want to ask a question that I saw coming up in the Q&A before we started from Tim Buter, and it touches on what you were just talking about so nicely, Aarathi, about decision making, but it's a hard question. I'm going to throw it back to both of you. So Tim has asked if you've observed any modifications or changes in how organizations have been making decisions since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, and if so, how? So I guess throwing that question back to you, Aarathi and Eilidh, because you both have been advising and consulting with humanitarian organizations over the past year in different degrees. Have you been seeing more uptake of Foresight's approaches? Have you been seeing any real shifts and changes in how organizations think about the future and make decisions? Or has there been not much change at all? So maybe going to Eilidh first and then back to Aarathi.
Certainly, I think there has been. I mean, we have seen a sort of an increased demand for foresight as people try and look for ways to manage uncertainty. I think one of the ways that I've seen organizational decision making shift slightly is that, from our perspective, a foresight is also only as good as the people you have participating in it. It draws hugely on expertise from other places. And so one of the things that we've seen organizations do is being able to use virtual platforms and also in person where it can be held locally. Organizations seem to have been using foresight processes as a way to increase inclusiveness in decision making, because part of what we try and do through foresight is not only give people the tools to try and manage uncertainty, but we've also seen it as a way to try and improve staff well-being. Some of the feedback when we first begin a project that we get from a lot of staff in big organizations in particular is in times of uncertainty, when they feel like there's not a lot of communication for leadership around how they're going to manage these dynamic environments. There's not a lot of sort of belief that there is a strategic plan in mind, that there's the competency in place to try and deal with these things. When staff seem to feel like the whole organization is somewhat muddling through, it seems to really be affecting their morale and their sort of faith in the leadership to be making decisions, especially at hard times when we see declining funding and we see sort of increased nervousness around things like redundancies and things like that. So one of the things that we've been encouraging organizations to do is to include their staff in these foresight processes, because not only does it give them a space to sort of express some of these fears and for the organization to try and manage them, but it also tries to make it a shared process to consider how, as an organization, you're going to face this issue and these uncertainties. And so that has multiple benefits. Number one, it's essential for robust analysis to be able to include those different perspectives. But also, I think those kind of shifts in decision-making processes live up to some of the very soft, but the commitments we've made around inclusion. And I think finally, it really seems to do wonders for staff well-being, for them to feel like they have a role and a space to be able to express their own perspectives, not only in the analysis that's going to feed decision-making, but also in the strategic process of how the organization is going to try and meet some of these challenges. So I've seen that in a couple of different organizations that we've been working with, and the feedback, mostly from staff who are not usually included in those processes, has been extremely positive in that way.
Great, thank you. And quick reflection on that, Aarathi?
Yeah, I think, look, I agree, absolutely. I mean, certainly from my perspective, we've seen a huge take-up in this, a huge interest in how can it be used, and across the system, whether it's at HQ, whether it's at country office level, people are curious, people are wanting to know how it can be applied. I think what's interesting is there's certainly a greater appetite and curiosity about it. I certainly agree with Eilidh in terms of a way of bringing people together to have a collective influence about what might be unrolling in front of them. I think what is delightful about this particular very stressful time we're all living in is this notion. I mean, to me, it's not so much about inclusion. It's about how do we get a much more plural sense, a plurality to the approaches that we're offering, a plurality to our strategic design. And when we have a much more diverse ways of incorporating that discussion, and as Eilidh said, foresight is certainly one element of that, to bring that through, it offers us that plurality and malleability of our strategic decisions, because we're able to understand and hear the nudges and nuances of how this is playing out in different contexts, right? We're not making broad assumptions of something from New York or Geneva or wherever, or from London, and then assuming that that's the way it's going to be rolling out. I think one of the beautiful things that I've seen shift this year with agencies is this sort of awakening moment. Often it's been so hard for those that have been working in change or innovation. For years it's been, the institution is really hard to shift. It's really bureaucratic. actually institutions have been able to shift. That's the sort of aha moment that came up. When push came to shove, we were able to make faster decisions. We somehow found the ways to allocate money differently. And suddenly we were able to do this. So something that seemed so impossible before, we realized we could. So the challenge for us, the provocation for us is, how do we keep that momentum going? How do we continue to have a much wider range of data points and intelligent points that inform our knowledge gathering, our plurality, and our decision making? And how do we shift ourselves and watch ourselves so that we're still not just thinking near term, we're thinking midterm, and maybe at times we could even push ourselves to think longer term, because a lot of the challenges we're facing are generational challenges, and a 4-year program and project cycle is not going to solve it.
Great, or even a 4-month. Yes, thank you. Thanks, Aarathi. I'm going to turn now, and just to mention that on that point about change, we have a whole breakout session that's going to be delving into that can we make these changes last, called Transforming Uncertainty. But I'm going to quickly go now to Juliet Parker, our Deputy Director at ALNAP, who's been monitoring the chat box. Juliet, can you tell us what some people have shared in terms of the approaches that they've found useful for managing the challenges related to COVID-19? And has there been anything on the gaps as well?
I think there's been one really useful comment about funding, that it's not necessarily about the volume of funding in response to Mark Lowcock's comments, but actually the flexibility of funding. And perhaps one of the key things that would help organisations manage the challenge better is flexible financing. There's also a couple of questions. One was around was to Eilidh, I think, around modifications in decision-making processes since the beginning of COVID. Had you seen any modifications to decision-making processes? And if so, what? And also a recognition that, yes, perhaps some of these scenarios should not be total surprises to us as well.
Great, thanks so much, Juliet. And then should we pass over to Daniel and see if there's also additional questions for the panel from Daniel, who is our program manager at ALNAP. Over to you, Daniel.
So there is another question, and it's from Lisa Schwartz. And is there a way to use this kind of forecasting without being stuck in either utopian or dystopian sort of plane and finding that it's not actionable?
Great, thanks so much, Daniel. So interesting that people have commented on kind of the flexible funding as being necessary for their approach to how they're going to be dealing with the challenges related to COVID-19. I would kind of pull that out to a more general question to pose to both of you, which is, flexible funding is also a way, it's an external sort of factor, right? And we've been talking a bit about how there are things that are within humanitarian organizations' control that they can actually shape in terms of affecting how well placed they are to deal with the turbulence and the uncertainty of COVID-19. So I was wondering if you have any commentary on kind of how you advise organizations to balance the external factors with the internal factors that are related to how they move forward and how they make change happen. And then going to Daniel's question from Lisa on how do we, basically going back to how do we make scenarios and how do we make foresights really actionable, avoiding kind of these dystopian and utopian scenarios that can seem quite far-fetched. I think you've touched on that in your comments already, but maybe you could say something a bit more about that. So going to you first, Aarathi, and then back to Eilidh.
Okay, two really, really solid questions. I think for me, it's really essential that when we look at futures, we are also considering what are the changes we need to make within so that we are better able to respond to the external, right? And what I mean by that isn't broad brushstrokes of statements. What I'm trying to get at is, what is our risk appetite? How are we testing our risk matrix? What is the process behind our strategy, our country plans, our regional plans, etc.? How are we evaluating it? How are we testing it beyond the sort of process of we do a midterm evaluation and then we just write the document and then that's it. How do we make it a living, breathing, anticipatory process? These aren't just words. We have to actually do the unsexy work. I mean, I think it's a bit sexy, but but the unsexy work of reframing and redesigning the back end part of all of this, right? The types of strategies that I have found have worked well, or that for me at least in my experience, make us a little bit more future fit are emergent strategies, right? So those are strategies that have got fully embedded and really rigorously thought through. And I haven't found an example of how this is done well, but when we are embracing learning through in that strategy process, because it allows us to test our assumptions. We ask sort of three fundamental questions, because redesigning a strategy and throwing the baby out with the bathwater isn't realistic. That's not what's going to happen. 60-70% of what we're going to do is going to remain the same, right? It's still going to be core. The question we're asking is, how do we innovate and improve on this to make it fit for where we want to go? Then there's a percentage that's going to be around what are we experimenting or innovating against, and so this is where we're trying to bring not random innovations, but those innovations and experimentations are tied to that future state or tied to the things that we are fundamentally uncertain about. And then there's going to be a smaller percentage of things, and we don't do this well. What has to die so that the right thing can live? If we know what is that future state we want to move into, or those range of future possibilities, then we need to redirect investment in some way. Something needs to give. And what is it that we need to give up in order to make that happen? So there's ways around how you design emergent strategies and malleable strategies. There's ways in which you think about the back end and your risk appetite and decision making and all that sort of back end processes that need to go with it, so that your exogenous and your internal go hand in hand. And then how do you design a set of options, both which are short-term programs or projects, some longer-term policy or advocacy, some innovation and experimentation that make up a portfolio of work rather than just projectized-based work, which responds to a more systemic, interconnected way. Now, that's really, really hard. It's easier for me to say this, but it's really hard to get done. Second point, I just want to come back really quickly before handing over to Eilidh.
I'm noting the time. I know we could go on for an hour like this, but yeah, just
just really quickly on scenarios. Yes, people design scenarios in binary, and I actually have a love-hate relationship with scenarios, because I think in our particular sector, our work is far too complex, too diverse, and has way too much plurality in it for us to rely on just like four different ones, right? So I come back to, if the way you're designing your scenarios is plural, then you do get multiples of perspectives in it. And if you can pull out the insights that speak to the nuance, then we're not going to end up with binary positions, right? Where it's either utopia or dystopia. It's those gray bits in between, which is the beauty of it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, just due to time, because I know we don't want to eat into people's coffee breaks, even when we're virtual. So I think we'll have to stop there, and I'll hand back to John in a second. But I think it's been a really rich conversation. Thank you so much to Eilidh and Aarathi. I think key themes that have come out of everything that you've said is that it's about widening, creating more plurality for options, and thinking about these processes as opportunities for change, not just challenges. And I think that's a great message for us to have going into these breakout sessions, where we can go into more detail on these different solutions. So thank you very much for joining us. And I'll hand back to you, John, to give people instructions on how to enter the breakout sessions.
Alice, thanks so much. Not only was that really energetic and interesting, it was very practical and very challenging in a good way. And I think I'll be going to sleep tonight dreaming about Aarathi's grey rhino hurtling towards me. But anyway, we're now going to take a short break. And when we come back, we're going to split into three groups who will focus on one of the three topics which we've mentioned before: managing uncertainty, resourcing for uncertainty, and finding opportunities for change and improvement. So you will have pre-selected your breakout sessions during registration, and you can see which one you selected in your agenda. And after the coffee break, please do click on the session's name to access it. So unless there's anything else from our tech team, I shall wish you all a happy coffee break and enjoy the breakout groups. Anything else from the tech team? Anything else? No? Good. Thank you, everybody. See you soon.